Hi, everybody. I'm Rachel Vincitore, and I'm sitting here with one of my favorite people, Erin Zerbe-Comer, and she goes by Z or Miss Z, which I like too.
Yes.
So Z came on as one of our art professors here at Atlantic University, maybe last year or so, year before, and you took on the fantastic task of rewriting one of our visual art classes. So I think the question I get a lot is, how in the world do you teach art online?
That is a fantastic question. And in this day and age, it's one that's being asked all over the country in all sorts of capacities, from the K-12 system all the way up to grad school. So how do you teach art online? I think that the best way to tackle that question is to talk about what art you're teaching, right? Just like anything you're teaching online, it's all about understanding the medium and understanding what it is that you're trying to do with your students, the messaging. And so I tend to be the type of professor and also the type of artist where I do a lot of reverse engineering. I look at where I want to get, and then how do I work my way backwards to get there. And so for this course and for this kind of an interaction, especially at the graduate level, we're really talking about how do you develop a sustainable art practice, whether you're a longtime art maker or you're just somebody who's dabbled or you've never made art ever in the history of ever. Like, well, how do you start that process? And sometimes that's what's really challenging. And so the way that the course is designed and the way that I kind of interact with the online component is, how do I help you as an artist facilitate what it is you want to make? How do we talk about that? And then how do we give you the tools, the tricks of the trade, and the opportunities to build that into your daily practice, to build that into your life? And so that's the way that you do it online. You talk about how do we give our students the motivation and the support that they need to be self-starters and to be self-directed learners, since that's what we're doing. And there's all sorts of ways to make that work, but that's the kind of crux of what we're going for.
Yeah, and that's, I think, a great answer to people, that part of it is creating it. And then the other is you as the professor kind of opening that artistic portal to ourselves. So tell me a bit about your background. We kind of jumped right in and I didn't even ask.
Totally fine.
So tell me a bit about you.
So I am a lifelong artist and a lifelong learner. That's something was one of those things. I came out of the womb and I was like, I'm going to be an artist. Like I was drawing before I could talk and was making marks on paper before I could write. So it was the only thing I was ever any good at and the only thing I ever really wanted to do. So my background, I have a MFA in Photographic and Electronic Media, and my Bachelor of Fine Arts is in Kinetic Imaging, which is talking about image making and movie making and thinking about time as a medium, right? Like how we make things over time. And I love to work. I consider myself an interdisciplinary artist. So my art practice is not medium focused. Like sometimes you'll meet people and they're like, I'm a painter, I'm a sculptor, or I'm a fabric worker, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
For me, my work runs the gamut from animation and photography and illustration to graphic design to sculptures to performance art. I run the gamut, and most of my work is really focused on concept and idea. And so I choose my mediums. I choose which way I'm going to work based on the idea at hand. What's going to communicate this idea most effectively? And that tends to be my process.
I love that. I love that blend of mediums, because I think for you, you can express it kind of as a collage, if you will, of mediums. So you get, I'm just a painter. I'm just a painter. And that's really what I am. So I paint. I don't do sculpture, but I like that idea. If I could, I think you can get so much more message through.
Right. Well, each one has its own like visual lexicon or its own language that you speak, just like any other discipline, there's genres and subgenres. And for me, it's often, well, what am I trying to say? And I think a lot of artists, they pick something that they like to do, and then they think about, what do I want to do with this thing? And again, if we go back to even how I designed the courses, it's like, what do I want to say? And what's the best way to say that thing? And so for me, a lot of the impetus for creating really comes from this idea that it's conversational, and that the focus of the art isn't to be preachy or didactic or to tell somebody how to feel. The focus of the work is to ask a question, to start a conversation.
Yes.
So based on that being the end goal, that helps me really pick and choose how I want to put things together. And I think the other fun part about that is it forces me to continue to be a learner. Like I have to learn new mediums all the time, because I'll wake up one night and go, oh, you know what? This needs to be a book. Never made a book. I guess I'm going to learn how to make a book, right? Like, and so I think that when you do that, you realize, well, you don't have to be the expert at something in order to do it. And doing it, the process of making is as valuable and sometimes more valuable than the artifact that you create. And that's something I really try to stress with my students as well. It doesn't have to be pretty. Sometimes it's just the act of making it. That in and of itself can be the art.
Well, and that's, I think, what a lot of people struggle with is we're always comparing our art to something else, especially novice amateur artists. Well, it doesn't look as good as so-and-so's. And that's probably something you deal with students all the time.
Absolutely. And I think you deal with it no matter if your students are focused on art education and you're teaching art students, or you're teaching students like in the context of the class at AU, where you might be teaching students that are experts in other fields that are working on other things, but they're thinking about art as a practice. My whole goal and kind of the first thing I tell students from word go is it is not about making something pretty or even making something well. It's about giving yourself permission to make something. Like that's the starting point. You need to give yourself the permission. You need to give yourself the space to create for the sake of creating for you. And that's where we get the shift from art that is commercial or art that has some sort of goal in mind, right? I'm going to sell a product or I'm going to design a space, right? That's one type of making. But when you shift the conversation to I'm going to make because it's about a need to make or a impetus to have a conversation, what suddenly happens there is then the art can become cathartic. Then the art is in service to the artist. And I think that that's a much more valuable experience to learn. And so that's something that we approach because you get a lot of that phobia. You think back to when you were in kindergarten, right? Kindergartners do not care whether or not their drawings are beautiful. And you know what? Their drawings are always beautiful.
They're always the best drawings,
because they just make, and they make from a place of pithiness and honesty and whimsy. And when you make that way, when you work that way, there's something that's happening. There's a catharsis that happens to the artist and also to the people that interact with the piece. They're not burdened by whether or not the colors are correct. They're not thinking about line and texture. They're like, I'm going to draw this cat with 17 stripes and a horn. And it's going to be legit. And you're like, yes, it is. That's exactly what you need right now. And there's something really freeing about that experience.
That's interesting because I was just having a conversation with somebody a million years ago in my undergrad. So my undergrad, I have a degree in humanities and studio art. So I actually went to school in Germany and had some expats and some German instructors. And one of the things I got taught was, it's not about your art, it's about your mind.
Yes.
I learned like, well, you have to use a complementary color. You have to use, Da Vinci perspectives. And I remember one artist, art teacher came over and said, why? Stop with all of your supposed tos. And I was like, what? She goes, do whatever you want. And that was really my biggest, and I still talk about this today, which is why I never have matching socks. Who said socks had to match?
Right.
And that's my biggest takeaway was, yes, you can teach someone how to draw, but you need to teach somebody to get out of their own way.
Yes, there's something that happens, and we talk about it in the class called flow state. And so and you get this, right? So something that happens is this beautiful moment that happens when you're creating just to create, when you let go, when you stop worrying about whether or not the piece is going to be beautiful, when you stop worrying about who's going to see it and how they're going to think about it and what they're going to say about it, when you're just making to make because you intrinsically need to make, or something about you that needs to get out, and the visual communication is the right way to do it, right? So if that happens, then what ends up going on is that your brain waves change. It's almost like when you're listening to alpha or theta waves, or when you're meditating, or when you're going through some sort of like spiritual healing, whether it's crystal healing or Reiki healing. Your brain does the same thing when you're making art. And what you're doing is you're channeling, right? You're connecting. And so we talk about altered states of consciousness in the class. And at Atlantic University, we talk about transpersonal approaches. So if you're thinking about what's going on in the brain, art is a very, very easy way to connect with that. And you start to see that there's a lot of parallels to the practice of being an artist and the practice of being a spiritualist or a shaman or a healer, that they run in tandem because they're doing the same things for us neurotypically that allow us to communicate in a way that words just don't have the capacity to communicate.
Exactly. And that's a great segue into really talking about your class that you're teaching right now, which is Intro to Transpersonal Visual Arts. So talk about that class a bit and how you bring all of what you just talked about, you know, how you bring art and the transpersonal together.
Well, it's one of those things that to my mind, they're always together. Like, so I think that that really helps me to see them as being one and the same. They're two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
Right? And so essentially it's about helping students understand the language of discussing those two things and to see the natural synergy or the confluence of those two practices, which are not separate practices. They actually are the same. And once you get past your fears of failing, because you fail forward, right? Once you get past your fears of making bad art or not making art that's good enough or not knowing what to say, and you allow yourself to have that experience, then you can start to really unpack things and break things open. And so the impetus of the class, or the long-term goal of what it is we're trying to do here, is whether you're brand new to transpersonal approaches or brand new to art, or you're an expert at both, there's something to be said about building in a daily practice and building in community with that practice. So the class is really built on having high level readings at the graduate level and what I call kindergarten exercises, which I know sounds, I don't mean it to sound pandering, it's definitely not. But one of the things I learned when I started teaching art at the college level was that students needed permission to just make.
Yes.
And what this class is designed to do is give them an experience with a variety of mediums, especially, you know, those who are new at working. So we're going to draw, but we're also going to paint, and we're going to make things out of clay, and we're going to work with sculpture, and we're going to work with performance. We're going to work with video. So you get to run the gamut to figure out what resonates with you, right? But all of the exercises are really based on exploring the medium in a low risk environment and being playful, having fun. Art has lost its sense of whimsy. And once you reinstitute whimsy, you do the same thing to your brain that you do when you meditate. And now suddenly you're open and now you can connect. And so the students will be learning a lot of approaches that come from like a shamanic practices. And then they'll be learning these studio art practices. And at the end, they start to just merge and become one and the same.
So beautiful. I love that. And this class, would you say this is from beginner to advanced?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You could come into the class having a studio art practice that you've nurtured for years, and you can come into the class as somebody who hasn't picked up a crayon since kindergarten. And one and the same, your work is going to do the same things and you're going to have the same experiences, because again, it's very much not about the artifact, the artistic item that you're creating. It's about the process of making. And so we're very process focused. It's giving you the space and giving you the mental energy to work with those things. And once you make that transition, then you can start to think about some of the other elements and principles of design. And then we start to kind of incorporate art speak. We look at a lot of artists who work this way, who make work that isn't beautiful. They make work that's kind of uncomfortable. They make work that's challenging, that's provocative.
Yes.
But the work is about having a conversation. The work is about these bigger concepts, this kind of transpersonal approach, and how art really is shamanism, how those two things are kind of the same thing.
That's a fantastic way to put it. Art is transpersonal and shamanism, but it's also a practice.
It is. And those are practices, right?
Yeah.
One of the things I have in my artist statement, and I get asked it with regularity, is, what do you mean when you say the artist is the modern day shaman?
Yes.
So when we think back to what a shaman did, or what a healer did, because I think that the word shaman can sometimes be problematic or misleading, but essentially what we're talking about is somebody who is in tune to the emotional and spiritual health of themselves and their community, right? So that person would experience some sort of altered state of consciousness to find ways to interact with their community, whether that is physical healing, emotional healing, spiritual healing, right? That was the role of the shaman. Now we look at artists and we look at what an artist does in society. Artists make work that ask very difficult questions. They make work that taps into what's going on culturally, right? So if you look at contemporary art, I truly believe that a contemporary artist is essentially performing the same
Yes.
functionality that a traditional shaman would have performed, which is to help go into an altered state of consciousness and come back with a message. And that message is either for themselves or for their community or for their culture at large. I mean, we're in a point right now in the West where this way of working and this way of being clearly might need to be rethought. And so when we look at art and we look at shamanism, we look at another way of being, and we look at another way of thinking. And then we ask the question, well, why can't this coexist? Why can't this be the way that the world is? And that's that idealism is what an artist does. They've always been the canary in the mine. They're always kind of on the precipice of what's going to happen. And that's exactly what a healer does too. So in my mind, they're the same thing.
I love it. So this class, Introduction to Transpersonal Visual Arts, is the introductory kind of gateway into what you teach here at Atlantic University.
Yeah.
And I believe we're going to do some mandalas as a transformative practice.
Absolutely. So the hope is that in the future, we'll be able to add that course and then possibly a couple of other courses that deal with the idea of art as numinous and art as transpersonal, art as transformative, and to really see how those coalesce. So this first class really can be introductory to transpersonal approaches or introductory to visual arts, because they both go in tandem. And so I guess my word of support for students who are kind of nervous about taking it is that if you feel a little nervous or you feel a little anxious, you're exactly where you need to be, because the magic really only happens when you shift out of your comfort zone. And so the only things that are mutually exclusive is your comfort zone and where the magic happens. Those two things never touch. You have to jump out of one to get to the other. But everything else really is about how they dovetail nicely and how you can take this practice that is a personal practice and hopefully find ways to imbue it into your practice with clients or what you're doing with your larger projects here at Atlantic University.
I think I'm going to leave with just that. That's a perfect ending, because it's so beautiful. And that's all we're looking for, is for each person to find their own transformation.
Yeah. And art is a really great way to do it. If you've never given yourself the opportunity, my guess is it might be exactly what you need.
Well, thank you so much, Miss Z, for joining me today. I love talking to you. So I know we'll do many more of these. Thanks again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Bye.